The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the small auto shop as the mechanic wiped the sweat from his brow and looked out into the dusty parking lot. He'd been up since dawn, tinkering with a particularly stubborn engine that refused to cooperate. The radio in the corner crackled with static, a country tune drifting through the cluttered workspace. As he leaned back against the counter, he saw her pull up in an old but well-maintained station wagon. The woman stepped out of the car, her brow furrowed in concentration as she surveyed the scene. She was dressed simply, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and her hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She didn't look like the kind of person who knew her way around an engine, but there was a determination in her eyes that caught the mechanic off guard. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he called, brushing his hands on a rag that was already stained black with grease. He forced a polite smile, though he couldn't help the hint of condescension that crept into his voice. She didn't miss it. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she approached the counter. "Actually," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I'm here to fix my car." The mechanic blinked, momentarily thrown by her confidence. He glanced at the battered wagon and then back at her. "Fix it yourself? This isn't exactly a simple job, you know," he said, unable to stop the smirk that tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Cars can be tricky." The woman didn't flinch. "I know, but I can handle it," she replied, her tone unwavering. She glanced around the shop, noting the scattered tools and the engine parts lining the shelves. "All I need is your tools. I'll take care of the rest." He let out a short laugh. "Sure, sweetheart," he said, shaking his head. "Tell you what, why don't you let me take a look instead? Might be faster that way." But she stood, her ground meeting his gaze without a hint of embarrassment. "I appreciate the offer, but I'd like to do it myself," she said, her eyes scanning the shelves as if already making a mental inventory. The mechanic raised an eyebrow. He'd been in this business for 20 years, and he'd seen plenty of people who thought they knew what they were doing. Most of them left more problems than they fixed. He wasn't trying to be rude, he was just practical. "Listen," he said, softening his tone slightly. "I'm sure you mean well, but engines aren't exactly easy. One wrong move, and you could make it worse." She gave him a half-smile. "I understand the risks. I'm not here to waste your time. I'm here to fix my car." Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity beneath her words, a certainty that told him she wasn't just bluffing. The mechanic sighed, glancing at the other cars waiting in line. The place was already backed up, and he didn't have time to argue. "All right," he said finally with a skeptical shrug. "Tools are over there, but don't say I didn't warn you." She nodded and walked over to the tool bench, her movements precise and assured. She picked up a wrench, testing its weight in her hand, and then grabbed a few other tools with the ease of someone who knew exactly what she needed. The mechanic watched, his curiosity piqued despite himself. He leaned back against the counter, folding his arms across his chest as he watched her pop the hood of the station wagon. She moved with a kind of quiet confidence that didn't match the dusty, unassuming image he'd formed of her. He couldn't help but chuckle softly, shaking his head. She'd learn soon enough that fixing cars wasn't a game. But as he watched her lean over the engine, her expression focused and determined, he had a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach, like he was about to be proven very, very wrong. 20 minutes had passed, and the mechanic found himself growing more and more intrigued by the scene unfolding in his own shop. He had fully expected the woman to fumble around for a few minutes before giving up and asking for help, but that moment never came. Instead, he watched as she methodically checked the belts, pulled out the air filter, and began inspecting the engine with the kind of confidence he'd rarely seen in anyone, let alone someone he'd dismissed just moments before. She worked, In silence, her brow furrowed as she traced wires and checked hoses. She didn't hesitate or fumble. She simply moved from one part of the engine to the next with a practiced precision. The mechanic had to admit he was impressed, though he'd never admit it out loud. He leaned forward on the counter, unable to tear his eyes away as she deftly swapped out a spark plug, her fingers moving quickly and efficiently. "Where'd you learn to do all that?" he asked, unable to hide the note of curiosity in his voice. His tone had lost its earlier condescension, replaced instead by genuine intrigue. She looked up from her work, meeting his gaze with a small smile. "My mom taught me," she said, her voice quiet but filled with pride. "She was a Formula One engineer. I spent my childhood in her garage, learning everything I could." The mechanic's eyebrows shot up. "Formula One? You're kidding," he said, genuinely stunned. He'd never met anyone connected to that world, let alone someone who'd been raised in it. She just smiled again, her hands moving to tighten a bolt before she wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "She always said there's no substitute for knowing your own engine. I guess I took that to heart." The mechanic chuckled softly, a note of admiration creeping into his voice. "I guess you did," he said. He pushed himself away from the counter, walking over to stand beside her. "Need an extra set of hands," he offered, his earlier skepticism gone. She paused for a moment, then nodded. "Actually, yeah," she said, passing him a wrench without missing a beat. Together they worked in companionable silence, swapping tools and checking connections. The mechanic found himself enjoying the easy rhythm of their teamwork, the quiet understanding that comes from two people who share the same respect for the hum of an engine. As they finished up the final checks, the woman straightened up, wiping her hands on an old rag. She turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a smooth purr that filled the garage. She grinned, satisfaction lighting up her face as she listened to the steady rhythm. The mechanic let out a low whistle. "Runs like a dream," he said, a smile breaking across his face. "You really know your stuff." She gave him a grateful smile. "Thanks," she said simply. As they closed the hood, the mechanic felt a flicker of embarrassment for having underestimated her. He realized with a pang of humility how quick he'd been to judge, how he'd let his assumptions about what a real mechanic looks like cloud his perspective. Just as she was gathering her things to leave, a shiny black SUV pulled into the lot. The door swung open, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out, scanning the garage until his eyes landed on the woman. "Miss Jensen," he said, his voice formal but warm. "The president would like to see you. He was very impressed by your quick thinking in fixing that plane's engine the other day." The mechanic's eyes widened in shock. He turned to the woman, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process what he'd just heard. "Plane's engine," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. She gave him a small, almost sheepish smile. "I guess I didn't mention that part," she said, her voice soft. "I was flying with my mum's team when we had an emergency landing. The engine failed mid-flight. I managed to fix it enough to get us back down safely." The mechanic's respect for her turned to awe. He watched her climb into the SUV, her calm confidence never wavering, and realized he'd just met someone truly remarkable, someone who had reminded him in the most unexpected of ways that skill and determination had nothing to do with appearances. As the SUV drove away, the mechanic returned to his work with a smile. He'd never forget the woman who'd walked into his shop that morning and shown him what true skill and quiet courage looked like.